Think of sports players. They are traded. They are sold. They have agents to take care of these transactions, these owners of these franchises.
And so, like, the fact that we even have to address this sort of thing, that the fact that this is put forth as a serious objection, it just blows my mind.
Why hello, my fellow apes. I hope you are well. Get ready to have your moral intuitions, let's say, violated. Completely and utterly violated. All, of course, in the name of religious love. Because we are about to deep dive into the mind of Christian elite, Paul Copan. Let's kick things off with a light question. Have you, like so many others, ever felt guilty about selling off your daughter as a slave? Be honest. Have you? You haven't? Ah, so you don't feel guilty. Well, I would issue a remark of disdain, but as we're about to learn from Paul, what you did is perfectly kosher.
A father selling his daughter? Oh, how cruel is that? Well, no, this is what happens when you're impoverished. And you know what? You're in your own tribal land, and you're going to be close to your own kinfolk.
You see? Paul's got your back. And not only should you feel good about selling your daughter, but you should know that God Almighty signs off on this. God said that it was good. I swear, Paul Copan should have gone for a career as a lawyer instead of an apologist. Can you imagine? I know it looks like my client was being cruel when he sold his children as slaves, but you have to understand that this was actually an act of kindness, so that the children would be fed by their masters. Wait, never mind. An apologist essentially is a defense lawyer for God. I know it looks cruel that my client murdered all of the firstborn children of a nation, but you just don't understand that this was a perfectly proportionate and humane act, considering that his own minority group had been treated terribly by the leaders of that nation. Yeah, they are eerily similar. They both aim to defend a client with rhetoric and bias, don't they? I know it looks cruel that my client murdered all of the men, women, and boys of that group and then took their girls as sex slaves, but you must understand that this was an act of kindness and passion. Plus, it's not like they were forced to have sex outside of wedlock, so it really wasn't all that bad. Now, you might be thinking that Paul can't be this bad, but if you've seen the last response I made to him, you'll know that he is, indeed, this bad. And what you're about to witness puts even the lawyer of Ted Bundy to shame. And talking of sophistry, before we delve deeper into our discussion about slavery, there's a crucial point that we need to address. It's essential, we're told, for us not to be overtly critical of the Bible regarding the concept of buying and selling people. You see, in our capitalist society, transactions are commonplace. We can trade notes for ice cream, sign up for a Patreon subscription to our favourite YouTube channels, and even sell card games. Ain't capitalism great? Well, to further illustrate this simple, uncoerced trade, let's see what insight Paul offers.
So, sometimes the language of the Old Testament will talk about selling, talk about, possess, and so forth. Well, don't be misled here, because what is happening is that the language of a legal transaction is being utilized. And I'm not saying that being having a position of servitude in Israel was something to be delighted about, that it wasn't hard, that you didn't have hard chores to do and so forth. But it meant that once you were done with your contract, you were free. Think of sports players. They are traded. They are sold. They have agents to take care of these transactions, these owners of these franchises. Boy, doesn't that sound crass? Are these, is LeBron James just a piece of furniture or farm equipment here? No, that's just the language. It's just the nature of these legal transactions. That's how it goes.
You hear that? You get it? You know all those verses in the Bible telling us that we can buy slaves, hit slaves, force children into slavery, and what have you. Well, it's a mistake for us to be thinking about those slaves as slaves. They're more like athletes entering a legal contract. It's all perfectly fine. Don't you just hate it when all these bloody atheists come up with these ridiculous notions about owning people as somehow being wrong, when in fact their favourite sport teams today own people? God, they're such hypocrites. Except, no. Something is telling me that this isn't a perfect analogy. I might even call it a false analogy. I mean, LeBron James earns an annual average salary of $49,511,644. And I might be wrong here, so don't quote me, but despite inflation, this seems a little more than what the slaves were earning in Israel. I don't have the exact figures, of course, but as far as I can tell, at least, pressing olives, digging wells, cooking and cleaning for food and shelter isn't quite the same as receiving the best medical and nutritional products and services available to bounce around a ball for millions of dollars. LeBron is also not, as far as I can tell, subjugated to beatings with a wooden rod. In any case, according to Paul at least, biblical slavery is not as bad as it sounds, as most apologists are very keen to point out biblical slavery was nothing like antebellum slavery.
A lot of people assume that this is talking about something that's tantamount to antebellum slavery in the U.S. South, and that is certainly not the case at all. There were provisions for those who are servants. I think servant is a better term. And it is a neutral term, too. It could simply mean worker, but is often related to a contractual arrangement that comes out of poverty. And so a person will sell himself or sell his family, as it were, into servitude because they have no option. So it's basically, when you talk about selling yourself, it's a contractual sort of a thing. And that you just say, I'm going to be an indentured servant until I can pay off my debt, again, maximum being 6 years, that you do that unless you align yourself to the person for whom you're working. You say, I love my master, my employer, and you align yourself with that person permanently.
Well then, isn't that quite the inverted picture? The conditions that slaves were given were so damn good that many of them opted to make themselves permanent slaves, slaves for life. Just like LeBron is, oh no, wait, that doesn't work either, does it? It's again a false analogy. One day, LeBron will retire with his millions and have until his dying day servants, not to be confused with slaves, at his beckoning call. And if his manager introduced him to his wife, he won't be forced to decide between playing forever to keep his family and leaving his family in order to retire. But if he does choose to retire, at least he gets the funds he earned during his career, unlike the slaves. Now, it must be emphasized, in all seriousness, that unlike myself, Paul is saying these things unironically, and he's loved by the apologetic community for it. They genuinely believe, like Paul, that there's scriptural and factual reason to laughably dismiss the notion that biblical slavery was anything like antebellum slavery. So what I thought I'd do is subject a renowned scholar and expert in the field of ancient Near Eastern languages and literature to Paul's claims. Someone who's not only an expert in these languages, but also an expert on biblical slavery. Namely, Dr. Joshua Bowen. So there's a clip from Paul Copan. What are your thoughts?
So I know Paul. Paul and I have interacted before, and he's a really nice guy. And so I want to say this with that in mind. But that is such a horrible take, and it's not his. That's not his. He's not the only one that has that take, right? This is one of the ways that apologists or people that are trying to engage with the atrocities that you see in the Hebrew Bible, this is one of the ways that they try to deal with this. Comparing slavery to NBA players in any capacity of slavery is just sick to me. And so when we talk about definitions of things, and obviously there's a whole philosophical aspect to this that I won't be able to talk about, but like when we try to ascertain what words mean in philology, for example, this Hebrew word eved for slave, when we try to ascertain what does this mean, or the Akkadian word wardu, or arad in Sumer, like when we're trying to and figure out what does it mean to say slave, you sort of have a constellation of characteristics that you say, okay, every time you see, or when you see this word appear, it's in a context where it's describing somebody that does this, or somebody that does that, or somebody that has this. This is the way that, one of the ways that we engage with and define what words, explain what they mean. And oftentimes there are a couple of characteristics that show up when you're trying to define this word that will also show up when trying to define this other word. There's some overlap, like a Venn diagram, right? There's some overlap between the two. So, for example, children can be beaten or are supposed to be beaten, right? In the Hebrew Bible, they're supposed to be physically disciplined, and they have to do what their parents tell them to do. And there are several characteristics that would overlap between a child and a slave. But there are definitive lines demarcating these two roles, right? These two positions in society. And so you can't just say, well, because these two or three things are in common between them, that means that they're the same thing. And that's the fallacy. This is the problem that Paul is falling into here. The trap that he's falling into is he's saying, well, I mean, you have language about trading NBA players or selling NBA players, or and so, well, you're having trading or buying or selling or whatever here in slaves. So that means that everything must overlap, right? They must be the same, because we certainly wouldn't say that LeBron James is a slave. Well, as Joel Baden says so often, miss me with that shit. And that's like, that to me is what you're not. LeBron James isn't going into anyone's home and having his freedom taken away, right? Being beaten to get him motivated to do work. He's not being given a wife, and the wife and the children remain the property of the master, right? In other words, LeBron James can wake up on a Monday morning and say, "Peace out," like enough of this basketball stuff. He can do it. He can leave, right? He's God, it's just so crazy that I have to say this out loud. The making this comparison between a person who is either temporarily or permanently owned, and when we say that, we mean like their freedom is taken away, right? When you have a debt slave, even if that debt slave comes in voluntarily, even if it's an Israelite debt slave that's taken involuntarily and he serves for the 6 years, by the way, like that's some great thing. He gets to go free after 6 years. Well, whoop-de-doo, right? Like, sick flex, bruh. Like, give me a break with this. But even for somebody like that, in that best case scenario, that they get to go free after 6 years, what happens if they want to go free after 2 weeks? Sorry, like, you're here. And so, like, the fact that we even have to address this sort of thing, that the fact that this is put forth as a serious objection, it just blows my mind, frankly. It just blows my mind. No, these are people, when it talks about buying and selling, this is an attempt to water this down. These are people that are bought and sold, right? Period. They are owned as property. And this is the other problem that you'll see, is this conflation between debt slavery and chattel slavery. Really, the way that apologists want to talk about slavery is they just want to talk about indentured servitude, right? They just want to talk about famine slavery. They just want to talk about debt slavery. And the reality is that debt slavery is horrible, and that they still have a huge uphill battle if they take it seriously with debt slavery. But the reality is that there's chattel slavery. People are owned as property for life. They can be passed on as inheritance to their children. They serve until they die, period.
What you've just seen is a small clip from my podcast with Dr. Joshua Bowen, which is currently available to all supporters of the channel and will be available to the rest of the world in due course. So, let's reiterate and expand on Joshua's critique of Paul. Firstly, when Paul says,
it could simply mean worker, but is often related to a contractual arrangement that comes out of poverty.
He is attempting to equate all biblical servitude with modern contractual agreements, which is absolutely ludicrous. Modern contracts are entered into willingly, with both parties having the right to negotiate terms, and usually most have exit clauses and a superseding body, for instance the government, that can override terms should they violate rights. Like the right to be free. Whereas even in the best case of Israelite servitude, that is, being a male Israelite, you are locked in and your master can extort you to give up those most favourable conditions. Add to this the fact that your contract, without your consent, could be sold to other masters, and that masters could discipline you at their whim, and that female Israelite slaves as well as foreign slaves were handed down as family heirlooms. Does it not become clear that the contortions of Copen's defence are far from adequate? Secondly, Paul's assertion that
servant is a better term, and it is a neutral term too,
is also ludicrous. The attempt to replace the term slave with servant in biblical discussions serves to obfuscate the moral issue. It's misleading and problematic for a variety of reasons. The term servant implies a level of agency and freedom that slave does not. Servants are generally considered to be employees who can leave their job if they are unhappy with their working conditions, whereas the slaves of Israel did not have this option, especially foreign slaves. And to present just one more issue with calling the slaves servants, the original Hebrew and Greek term used in the Bible are more accurately translated to slave rather than servant. These individuals were owned as property and had no personal freedom. That is not a servant. Alfred could leave Batman whenever he wanted.
Maybe it's time we all stop trying to outsmart the truth and let it have its day.
It's funny, ain't it? Apologists will insist upon perfect Hebrew and Greek translations when it benefits their case, but so easily sidestep it when it doesn't. Food for thought. Thirdly, Paul's hypothetical person stating,
I'm going to be an indentured servant until I can pay off my debt,
has at least two glaring issues. It is, at base, a masterclass in missing the point. While there's a difference between a permanent and temporary slave, both are predicated on a lack of freedom, agency, and basic human rights. Using the term indentured servant to describe the situation is like saying that a person that's stuck in quicksand is just temporarily motionless. The core issue isn't the duration of the entrapment, it's the entrapment itself. The other glaring issue is that only a specific type of slave could pay off their debt, and, as is implied, subsequently go free, namely, Israelite men. Israelite women, and especially foreign slaves, were afforded no such opportunity. Moving on to the fourth objection, the notion that
you say, I love my master, my employer, and you align yourself with that person permanently.
Doesn't make the institution any less problematic. It's like saying, well, some hostages develop Stockholm Syndrome, so kidnapping can't be all that bad. To really illustrate the absurdity of Paul's hand-waving here, let's think for a moment of what might convince a slave to relinquish themselves in perpetuity to their master. Because Paul treats this decision as completely divorced from economic, social, and psychological factors. To just scratch the surface, economic constraints might limit a freed slave's opportunities, making staying with their master a necessity rather than a choice. Or, perhaps, the societal stigma of being a former slave could hinder social mobility and relationships. Or, indeed, the psychological toll of prolonged servitude might lead to decisions rooted in dependency rather than genuine affection. Or, as the Bible describes, the master could simply provide the slave with a lover and then extort the slave to stay with his wife and children. In essence, Paul has grossly simplified the multifaceted socio-economic and psychological factors influencing a slave's choice to stay. He has no consideration whatsoever for extortion. Lastly, even if Paul's attempt to completely differentiate biblical servitude from
antebellum slavery in the U.S. South
was sound, and it ain't, it would nevertheless be a red herring. Just because they're not identical doesn't mean that one is morally acceptable. It's like saying, well, it's only assault, it's not battery. Now, we could go on, but let's slow this train down. My reason for making this series of responses to Paul, and indeed one of the main reasons I make content altogether, is because I feel it's so incredibly important to demonstrate how distorted the apologist mindset is, as it shows us how humans can rationalize any form of atrocity. As George Orwell put it, albeit in the context of nationalism,
the point is that as soon as fear, hatred, jealousy and power worship are involved, the sense of reality becomes unhinged. And, as I have pointed out already, the sense of right and wrong becomes unhinged also. There is no crime, absolutely none, that cannot be condoned when our side commits it, even if one does not deny that the crime has happened, even if one knows that it is exactly the same crime as one has condemned in some other cases, even if one admits in an intellectual sense that it is unjustified, still one cannot feel that it is wrong. Loyalty is involved, and so pity ceases to function.
At the beginning, I facetiously compared apologists to lawyers, but behind the laughter, this is more than less my view of apologetics, and Paul Copan epitomizes the creed. There's a reason religiosity tends to go hand in hand with nationalism. Both serve the same masters, dogma and tribalism. The pious can easily see flaws and moral failings in others, but when their side is at fault, they contort themselves to dismiss any atrocity. Their scholars, their creme de la creme, flat out ignore unambiguous divine instructions by referencing vague verses from other parts of the Bible. They insist that certain passages are out of context when the context only makes them worse. They bend over backwards to paint acts of infanticide, genocide, and slavery as justified or merciful. They claim that we can't judge the past by modern standards, as if empathy and ethics are monopolized by the present. And when backed into a corner, they even go so far as to deny their own holy text, dismissing passages that contradict their intuitions as metaphor and allegory. They project their own warped moral framework onto their religion, rather than deriving their morality from its supposed perfect dictates. At every turn, the truth is sacrificed on the altar of dogma and tribal loyalty. Facts are cast aside to validate long-held convictions. Morality is compartmentalized to avoid cognitive dissonance. Apologetics does not seek truth, only to defend their client, their faith. Its mission is not ethical consistency, but self-preservation through moral contortionism. And Copan's mental gymnastics on slavery demonstrates the modus operandi of apologetics in full transparency. But it's not just he who is enslaved by this nonsense. We are too, as a culture. By being drenched in biblical stories from birth, we fail to see the likes of Paul for what he is. If Paul was defending you-know-who and hand-waving away you-know-what, we'd refuse this man respect, not to mention accolades. But when he defends our culture's atrocities, the genocide of the Midianites for instance, all the awards are thrown at his feet, and even those that disagree with him treat him with respect. This is the greatest joke religion has played on humanity, and we are the punchline. If there is a good God, it didn't sign off on this monstrosity. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to everyone who supports the channel. We can't do this without you, and myself and the team greatly appreciate it. Lastly, please be sure to check out the links in the description to explore Dr. Joshua Bowen's amazing work. I cannot thank him enough for enduring Paul Copan, and I am really looking forward to publishing our full conversation in a few days or so. Thank you.
God, it's just so crazy that I have to say this out loud.